Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
One day later, on December 8th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to go to war with Japan. Within an hour, Congress approved the declaration of war and declared war on Japan. Within a few months, the U.S. also declared war on Italy and Germany. After fighting with Britain to perish German and Italian forces from Africa, American forces, British forces, and their allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, France on June 6, 1944. After France was liberated from Axis forces, the Allies started to move into Germany. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a major offensive against the Allies.
What was the Battle of the Bulge?
The Battle of the Bulge, major World War II battle. It's going to be considered the last major German offensive on the Western Front. It's going to run roughly about a month and a half. It's going to start middle-end December and run to almost the end of January. And it turns into be the major turning point of World War II after the landing at Normandy.
What Pacific events led to the Battle of the Bulge?
The specific events that led to the Battle of the Bulge during World War II in Europe were basically the fact that Hitler had to put forth a last-ditch effort to stop the Allied offensive on the Western Front. He was losing badly on the Eastern Front as well. He was hoping to demoralize the Americans and stop them from crossing the Rhine River. They were approaching the Rhine River. The Brits were on the northern edge and the Americans were all along the south, and were pushing farther and farther into German territory. So in December of 1944, during a particularly nasty winter storm, the Germans, who had been training themselves to act as Americans and had actually seized American personnel to train them on passwords and things of that nature, train them on the English language, train them on how to react like an American GI. And they also had American equipment, American uniforms, and everything else. They basically ambushed many units that were in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, near the city of Bastogne. And they completely surrounded the city of Bastogne and had many American troops stuck there, and it was like the worst winter storm in like 4 or 5 years. So the Americans themselves were thrown for a loop, especially their leadership.
How did the Americans survive the siege of Bastogne?
How? Well, it's interesting as far as that point, because that's all they had to do was survive. They were completely encircled by Nazi Germany, and they held a vital, pivotal point right outside the city because there was tons of roads that that Nazi Germany could use. I think it runs about December 20th through the 27th. And for a week they had to survive in extremely cold temperatures, and it was something where basically they just had to survive. I did read an article, it was interesting, where they only had fire during the day because with the fire at night it would give away their positions to the Nazi army. So thinking along those lines, the coldest time of the day they had to survive without fire.
What were some of the hardships from the American side?
Well, the Americans themselves were almost overrunning their logistics train. Their food, their fuel, all of the armaments they needed, their extra bullets, their extra rounds for their tanks and things of this nature. And especially their fuel. because the Americans ran on their trucks, their 1.5-ton trucks. And they were almost at the extent of overrunning the supply lines that they had. And the Germans knew this. So one of the tricks they used was taking units and actually redirecting them into ambushes, because they acted as Americans, and the Americans, they didn't hear any Germans, they didn't see any Germans, so that they automatically just followed along, because their lines were spread out so far. So that was one hardship, that they were already running out of food, they were already running out of fuel, so they couldn't go very far. They only had maybe a couple of days supply left. Plus, as I said, this was in December of 1944, and Central Europe is known for really bad winter storms, which the Americans didn't realize that much, but they found out this time, because they were in snow 2 and 3 feet deep. And since they had run out of fuel, some of them were just walking. That's the only way they could get anywhere. And in and amongst this, they were getting ambushed right and left. They had no idea where the units were that they were supposed to be with. Some of them had, completely lost their, commanders and their sergeants, so they were just wandering around on their own. That was amongst the worst. And then those that were left and weren't surrounded, killed, or captured by the Germans were stuck in the city of Bastogne, completely surrounded by what was left of the German army.
What events led to the Allies defeating the Germans?
Basically, what had to happen, and what the Americans that were in the city of Bastogne held on. They didn't surrender to the Germans. And the rest of the German leadership, from Eisenhower on down, realized that they had overextended their lines, and that they had to basically regroup and back up a little bit in some cases, or at least come back to the aid of those who were caught in this trap in the city of Bastogne. And the reason it was called the Battle of the Bulge is because their lines, the American lines, had bulged out, and then the Germans had encircled that bulge. So what the Americans had to do was basically come back and encircle the Germans. Because this was the last effort that the German army had, because their resources were almost completely tapped out, by early 1945, which was January 1945, the Germans had basically no troops left, and the only troops they had left, they had pushed all into the Eastern Front to stop the advance of the Soviet army. So what they had left for the Battle of the Bulge, once those people and those troops started falling prey to the Americans, all they had left was National Guardsmen and teenagers and old men. They didn't even have any men left to run their industries in the German heartland. So in reality, the Battle of the Bulge, although it was supposed to be a last-ditch effort to stop the American advance, actually made it go faster, because it used up the available troops and resources faster.
What would have happened if the Germans defeated the Allies?
In this specific battle, if the Germans had forced the Americans to surrender the troops that were in Bastogne, it would have been, in most people's opinion, a minor setback. Obviously, for the troops involved, it would have been horrendous. And it would have been a propaganda coup, proving that the Allies wouldn't, everything wouldn't go their way, and Hitler could have stopped some things from occurring. Plus, he had other things in work that he was trying to push to fruition, things such as his nuclear program to develop nuclear bombs, and his rocket program, the V-1 and the V-2s, and his jet aircraft programs. All of these programs needed not just more resources, but more time. So Hitler was trying to pay for time that he really didn't have. And by the fact that the Battle of the Bulge really didn't stop the American advance, it just basically kind of paused it for a moment, meant that his downfall was inevitable. The fact that his army and his capital city was enveloped by Soviet troops and not American troops was more a result of the leaders of the Allies and the leaders of the armies kind of agreeing, okay, the Americans are not going to run so fast, and the Soviets will hurry up and catch up, and we'll take Berlin first, and then the Americans will take other things. And of course they had horrendous surprises along the way, such as all the concentration camps that they had to liberate. So there were still a lot of events to occur before the end of the war and the total unconditional surrender of Hitler.
What are your thoughts on the battle, and was it worth it?
Thoughts on the battle? It's kind of a fascinating battle from the point of what happens directly before and what happens directly after, because it's going to be a surprise attack by the Nazi Germans. The United States is going to miss some key hints that it's going to happen. Once it does happen, though, it's very extremely important, because Nazi Germany needs to break through the Allied defenses, and without them doing that, it's essentially going to start to end the war. It's the second bloodiest battle in American history, but also it's probably one of the most important, because it goes with a fast track to the end of World War II. You got to think the end of the Battle of the Bulge is January 1945. By May of 1945, you end up with World War II being over in the European theater. Also, an interesting aspect of that is it kind of speeds up the Soviets attacking in the Eastern Front as they continue to close in. Overall, I mean, it does lead to the end of World War II. So if you ask if it's worth it, I think it's hard to say no.
On January 25th, 1945, German forces surrendered to the Allies, ending the Battle of the Bulge. Germany wasted their resources on the Western Front, causing the Eastern Allies to invade Germany and begin the downfall of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany.